At the moment when Nancy was washing dishes in the small kitchen, the young man who helped her entered without saying a word. And that's when everything began to turn upside down. David knelt on the floor of Nancy's living room, scrubbing a stubborn stain with a wet rag, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands moved quickly, almost frantic, as if cleaning the house could somehow erase the anxiety that gripped him. The scent of lemon cleaner lingered in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from the kitchen. He glanced over his shoulder at Nancy, who stood at the stove, wiping down its surface with slow, deliberate motions. "You think she's really coming?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. Nancy sighed, brushing a stray braid from her face. "Lisa doesn't do casual drop-ins, David. If she said she might stop by, she's coming." Her voice carried a mix of nerves and resolve, the same tone she'd used earlier when they decided to tackle the house together. I want her to see things are okay." David knew what she meant without her saying it. Lisa wasn't just Nancy's therapist. She was also his mother. The dual roles twisted the already complicated situation between them into a tangled knot of expectations and unspoken judgments. Nancy wanted approval. David wanted understanding. Both of them felt the weight of the stakes. He wrung out the rag into a bucket of murky water and moved to a new spot on the floor. "It's not like we're doing anything wrong," he mumbled, more to himself than her. Nancy's sharp laugh echoed across the room. "David, your mom's a therapist. I'm her client. This isn't exactly textbook healthy, is it?" David paused, the rag suspended mid-air. He looked up at her, catching the faint tremble in her hands as she adjusted a pot on the stove. "She doesn't get to decide what's right for us." Nancy met his gaze, her expression softening. "You don't think she will?" "David, she's your mom." He opened his mouth to reply, but stopped when a gust of wind rattled the windows. Both of them turned toward the sound instinctively. The night seemed to press against the house, an invisible force waiting to burst through. "She'll see how hard we're trying," he said finally, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. The faint vibration of a phone cut through the silence. Nancy fished it out of her pocket and frowned at the screen. A call. Not Lisa, but someone else. She hesitated before rejecting it, the tension in her shoulders rising another notch. David pushed himself to his feet, stretching his back. "Maybe Marcus was right," he said, glancing toward the sculptures he'd hurriedly stashed behind the sofa. "Maybe we're overthinking this." Nancy arched an eyebrow. "And leave the house looking like this? No way." She gestured toward the mess that still lingered despite their efforts, the pile of tools in the corner, the unswept bits of dust clinging to the edges of the room. He couldn't argue. Instead, he grabbed the bucket and headed for the kitchen, his footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet. The small house felt larger tonight, like every corner carried a shadow of something unspoken. Nancy's voice followed him. "Don't forget the sculpture on the shelf, the bronze one. It's too good to hide." David stopped mid-stride. "You think she'd even care?" "She will," Nancy said simply. "It's you." He didn't respond, but her words clung to him as he set the bucket down by the sink. Turning, he glanced at the shelf near the far wall. The bronze sculpture rested there, a piece he'd been working on for weeks, but had never finished. Its jagged edges seemed to reflect his own unease. His hand hovered over it before finally lifting it from its place. It felt heavier than usual, as though it carried the weight of all his doubts and hopes. He set it on the counter, wiping off a speck of dust with his sleeve. Behind him, Nancy spoke again. "The kitchen's done. Let's focus on the living room, David nodded, but as he moved back toward the main area, the sound of the wind picked up again, louder this time. A sharp knock at the door made them both freeze. Nancy turned to him, her face pale. "Is it her?" David's heart raced as he stared at the front door. For a moment, neither of them moved. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Swallowing hard, David stepped forward, his legs stiff and his hands damp with sweat. The closer he got to the door, the louder the silence behind him seemed. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they touched the cool metal of the doorknob. He looked back at Nancy. Her eyes were wide, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, David turned the knob, bracing himself for whatever, or whoever, was waiting on the other side. David opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. A familiar face greeted him, not the stern expression of his mother, but the slightly disheveled and boyish grin of Marcus. "Man, you're not gonna believe the traffic," Marcus said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His arms were full, an overstuffed art portfolio, and a small pouch of brushes threatening to spill. "You left these at the studio. Figured you'd need them for the commission." David blinked, still caught between relief and confusion. "Marcus, now's not—" "What's up with the energy in here?" Marcus asked, finally looking around. His smile faltered as he took in the nervous tension hanging over the room like a storm cloud. Nancy stood near the sofa, a dish rag clutched in her hands, her posture rigid. Marcus gave a small wave. "Hey, Nancy? Didn't mean to interrupt your deep-cleaning party." Nancy forced a smile. "It's fine, Marcus. Just bad timing." David shut the door and turned back, running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't be here." Marcus raised his hands defensively, his portfolio slipping a little. "Whoa! Sorry for trying to help. What's going on?" David glanced at Nancy before answering, his voice low. "Lisa might show up tonight." Marcus's eyes widened. "Your mom? Here? Now? And you didn't think to warn me before I came strolling in?" "She said she might stop by," Nancy interjected, her tone sharper than intended. "We're trying to—" She paused, gesturing to the cluttered room. "We're trying to fix everything before she gets here." Marcus set his things down carefully on the edge of the sofa, his expression turning serious. "Okay, so your mom showing up is bad, because she's my therapist," Nancy said flatly. "And David is—" Marcus nodded, piecing it together. "Ah, I see. Ethical gray zone. Family drama. Got it." He paused, tilting his head toward David. "And you didn't think this was something to mention before you started, whatever this is?" David glared at him. "I didn't exactly plan for tonight to turn into this." Marcus held up his hands again, this time more like a peace offering. Okay. Look, if she does show up, I'll keep her distracted. Take her out for coffee or something. Problem solved." "It's not that simple," Nancy said, sinking onto the armrest of the sofa. Her voice wavered as she spoke. "Lisa's intense. She'll see through anything like that. And if she thinks I've been hiding something—" She stopped, shaking her head. "No, we have to face her." Marcus looked between the two of them, his playful demeanor giving way to genuine concern. "You guys really care about this, huh?" David's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "It's not just about her being my mom. It's about her seeing that Nancy and I—" "Work," Nancy finished for him softly. For a moment, silence settled over them, broken only by the faint sound of the wind rattling the windows again. Marcus exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right? What do you need me to do? David gestured to the scattered tools on the floor. Help me get this place in order, fast. Without another word, Marcus rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved quickly, gathering loose papers and sketch pads while David adjusted the positions of a few sculptures. Nancy returned to the kitchen, wiping down counters and putting away dishes with the kind of hurried focus that bordered on frantic. As they worked, Marcus glanced at one of David's unfinished sculptures, a twisted, abstract figure with sharp angles and a hauntingly human expression. "This one's new," he said, holding it up. "Different vibe from your usual stuff." David barely glanced at it. "Leave it there. I'll deal with it later." "Man, you've been holding out on me. This is—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence when the sound of a phone vibrating broke through the room. All three froze. Nancy reached for her pocket, pulling out her phone and staring at the screen. "It's her," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. David stopped what he was doing, his heart pounding. "What's she saying?" Nancy hesitated before answering. "She's not saying anything. It's just a missed call." "Call her back," Marcus suggested. "No," David cut in quickly. "If she's on her way, we don't have time for questions or explanations." Nancy nodded, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed out her apron. "Let's just finish." They moved faster now, the pressure palpable. Marcus closed the windows, muttering under his breath about the storm brewing outside. Nancy stacked dishes in the cupboard, her motions growing more erratic as the minutes ticked by. David crouched near the sofa, adjusting the placement of the bronze sculpture that seemed to have become a focal point of his anxiety. A sudden gust of wind slammed one of the windows shut, making Marcus jump. "Seriously? You've got ghosts in here, or what?" Nancy didn't respond, but her hands gripped the edge of the counter tightly. David stood up, his gaze fixed on the bronze sculpture. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like it mattered more than anything else in the room. He reached out, adjusting its position slightly. "You good, man?" Marcus asked, watching him carefully. David nodded, though his hands still shook. "Yeah, I'm fine." Another knock at the door made all three of them freeze. This time, it wasn't the sharp, impatient knock from before. It was slower, deliberate, almost hesitant. They exchanged nervous glances. Nancy broke the silence. It could be her. David took a step toward the door, his chest tight. Every part of him screamed to stay where he was, but he forced his feet to move. The knock came again, softer this time. He reached for the handle, feeling the weight of everything on the other side pressing down on him. As he turned the knob, he glanced back at Marcus and Nancy. They both watched him intently, their faces a mix of anticipation and dread. The door opened just a crack, and David peered through, his breath catching. Behind him, the wind rattled the windows once more, as if the house itself was bracing for what was about to come. The door swung open wider, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and an air of authority that filled the small space instantly. David recognized him immediately. Jason, his older cousin, and someone who rarely made an appearance unless it was to lecture or criticize. "Jason!" David's voice was a mix of confusion and unease. "What are you doing here?" Jason stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his dark eyes scanning the room. "I came to talk some sense into you," he said, his tone laced with disapproval. "The whole family's been talking about this situation." His gaze landed on Nancy, who stood by the counter, her expression a mask of calm that didn't quite hide the tension beneath. "And now I see it's worse than I thought." Nancy straightened her back, refusing to let his presence intimidate her. "If you have something to say, Jason, say it," she said evenly. Jason let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, I've got plenty to say, starting with how ridiculous this all is. David, you're young, you've got potential, and yet here you are, throwing your life away for—" He gestured toward Nancy, his words hanging in the air like a dagger. "This mess." David felt a wave of anger rise in his chest, his fists clenching at his sides. "Don't talk about her like that," he said sharply. Jason raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "I'm not here to sugarcoat anything. You're making a fool of yourself. She's older than you, divorced, and—" He hesitated, his voice dropping to a sneer. "And you really think the family's going to accept this?" Nancy's face hardened, but she said nothing. It wasn't the first time she'd faced thinly veiled prejudice, and she knew better than to engage with it head-on. David, however, was another story. "Who cares what the family thinks?" David shot back, stepping closer to Jason. "This is my life, not theirs, and definitely not yours." Jason smirked, as if David's defiance was exactly what he'd expected. "You're too young to understand the consequences of your choices. And let's not pretend this is just about you. She's using you, David." Nancy's composure cracked. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice sharp as glass. "I'm standing right here, Jason. If you have an accusation to make, don't hide behind him." Jason turned his full attention to her, his expression cold. "Fine. I think you're taking advantage of him. He's got a bright future ahead of him, and you're holding him back." David stepped between them, his chest tight with rage. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice louder than he intended. The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "You don't know anything about us, Jason. You don't know what we've been through." Jason's eyes narrowed. "And you think I'm just going to stand by and watch you ruin your life?" Before David could respond, Jason stepped forward and shoved him, hard enough to make him stumble back into the coffee table. The sound of objects clattering to the floor broke the stillness, and Nancy gasped, rushing forward. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice trembling with anger and fear. Marcus, who had been watching from the corner with wide eyes, finally stepped in. Hey, that's enough," he said, moving to grab Jason's arm, but Jason shrugged him off with ease. David, shaking off the shock, stood back up and squared his shoulders. His heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "If you want to fight, fine," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "But you're not going to talk to her like that." Jason scoffed. "What are you going to do? You think you're tough enough to take me?" Nancy moved to stand beside David, her eyes blazing with fury. "He doesn't have to prove anything to you. You don't get to come into my house and dictate our lives." Jason laughed bitterly. "Your house. This is his mess too, and someone has to clean it up." The comment hit harder than any punch, but David didn't flinch. Instead, he reached for the broken bronze sculpture that had fallen during the scuffle. He held it up, the jagged edges catching the light like a shield. "This," David said, his voice low and firm, "is what I've been working on. What I care about. What you'll never understand." Jason hesitated, his eyes flicking to the sculpture. Something in David's expression, defiant, unwavering, made him pause. For the first time, Jason looked uncertain. "You don't scare me," David continued, stepping closer. "You don't get to decide who I am or who I love. You've done enough damage." Jason's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. The room was silent except for the faint creak of the floor beneath their feet. Finally, Jason took a step back, his gaze darting between David and Nancy. "This isn't over," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less bitter. "You'll see I'm right eventually." He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Nancy let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the back of a chair for support. Marcus leaned against the wall, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well," he said, breaking the tension, "that was something." David lowered the sculpture, his arms suddenly heavy. His heart still raced, but the immediate danger had passed. He turned to Nancy, his voice soft. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands still trembled. "I'm fine." "Are you—" David didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, his emotions a chaotic mix of anger, relief, and exhaustion. He looked at the sculpture in his hand, now slightly dented from the fall. It wasn't perfect, but it was still standing. "We'll be okay," he said finally, more to himself than anyone else. The sound of footsteps outside the door made them all freeze. This time, they weren't heavy and forceful like Jason's. They were lighter, deliberate, and heading toward the back door. David and Nancy exchanged a tense glance. Someone else was coming. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, but unhurried. David felt his heart pounding in his chest as he moved toward the back door, gripping the still-dented bronze sculpture tightly in his hand. Nancy and Marcus followed close behind, their faces a mix of confusion and unease. When the door creaked open, it wasn't Lisa standing there. A woman, unfamiliar but oddly composed, stepped inside. She had sharp features, a tailored blazer, and an air of confidence that immediately filled the room. Her gaze swept over them, taking in the disarray, the tension hanging in the air, and the dented sculpture in David's hand. "Good evening," she said smoothly, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'm here for Nancy." Nancy blinked, taking a hesitant step forward. "Excuse me. Who are you?" The woman smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. "I work with Lisa. She sent me ahead to check on things before she arrives." Her eyes flicked briefly to David, then to the sculptures scattered around the room. "It seems I came at the right time." David narrowed his eyes, stepping protectively in front of Nancy. "Lisa never mentioned sending anyone," he said, his voice firm. The woman's smile didn't waver. "It must have slipped her mind. Things have been quite busy lately, as I'm sure you understand." Her tone was polite, almost pleasant, but there was an edge to her words that made David's stomach twist. Marcus crossed his arms, leaning casually against the wall. "You've got a name? Or are we supposed to just call you Lisa's mysterious assistant?" The woman turned her gaze to him, her smile growing tighter. "You can call me Charlotte." "Right," Marcus said, clearly unconvinced. "And why exactly are you here? What's Lisa so busy with that she sent you instead?" Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked further into the room, her eyes lingering on one of David's sculptures, a sleek, abstract piece that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "Lisa has concerns," she said finally, her voice thoughtful, "about boundaries, about priorities." Her gaze flicked to Nancy. "About choices." Nancy's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. David stepped closer to Charlotte, his grip on the bronze sculpture tightening. "If you have something to say it," he said sharply. Charlotte tilted her head, studying him like he was one of his own unfinished works. "You're very talented," she said, ignoring his demand. She reached out, running a finger lightly over the edge of the sculpture. "Raw, unpolished. But there's potential here." David pulled the sculpture back, his expression hardening. "Don't touch that," Charlotte raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Sensitive, aren't we?" She turned her attention back to Nancy. "Lisa's concerned that you're not thinking clearly, Nancy. That this relationship might be clouding your judgment." Nancy finally found her voice, her tone icy. "Lisa doesn't get to dictate my life, and neither do you." Charlotte shrugged, unbothered. "I'm just here to observe. To help." She glanced at David again, her expression unreadable, though I can see why she'd be worried. "Worried about what?" David asked, his voice rising. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Charlotte didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked over to the bronze sculpture on the counter, the one David had been working on for weeks. She studied it closely, her fingers hovering just above the surface. "It's interesting," she said, almost to herself. "Not quite finished, though. A little like you, I suppose." David moved to block her view, his frustration boiling over. "Get to the point," he snapped. Charlotte straightened, her calm demeanor never faltering. "The point," she said slowly, "is that Lisa isn't just worried about Nancy. She's worried about you, David. About your stability, your ability to handle rejection, criticism, pressure." Nancy stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. "You don't know him. You don't know anything about us." "Don't I?" Charlotte asked, her gaze locked on Nancy. "I know that you're her patient, that you're vulnerable, and I know that David here has a lot riding on his passions." She gestured vaguely to the sculptures around the room. "It's easy to get lost in something or someone that feels like an escape." David felt like he'd been punched in the gut. He opened his mouth to respond, but Nancy beat him to it. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't know who you are or what your real intentions are, but you have no right to come into my home and make judgments about my life." Charlotte's smile faltered for the first time. "I'm just trying to help." "Help?" Marcus cut in, pushing off the wall and stepping closer. "You call this helping? Sounds more like stirring up trouble to me." Charlotte turned to him, her expression cold. "You're not part of this." "Neither are you," Marcus shot back. "So maybe it's time for you to leave." For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Then Charlotte's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen before slipping it back with a sigh. "Well," she said, smoothing her blazer, "it seems Lisa will be here shortly. I'll leave you to prepare." She turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before she stepped outside. "Oh, and Nancy, think carefully about what you want. Sometimes the hardest choices are the right ones." With that, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was deafening. Nancy sank onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. What just happened? David placed the bronze sculpture back on the counter, his hands shaking. "I don't know," he admitted. "But something's not right about her." Marcus sat down beside Nancy, his usually light-hearted expression now serious. "She's not just some assistant. She's up to something." Nancy nodded, her voice barely audible. "Lisa's coming. We have to be ready." David glanced toward the door, his stomach churning. Charlotte's words lingered in his mind, her calm but cutting tone echoing like a warning. Something about her felt wrong, calculated, almost predatory. But there wasn't time to dwell on it now. Lisa would be there soon, and whatever judgment she brought with her could change everything. Nancy hung up the phone and looked at David, her voice trembling. "She's on her way. 15 minutes. Maybe less." David nodded, his pulse quickening. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't out of the woods yet. David stood in the middle of the room, staring at the bronze sculpture on the counter. The sound of Charlotte's parting words still echoed in his ears, a reminder that Lisa was now minutes away. His chest tightened with anxiety as he glanced at Nancy, who was pacing near the kitchen, her movements sharp and erratic. Marcus sat on the edge of the couch, his elbows resting on his knees. "Okay, let's not panic," he said, though his voice betrayed his own unease. "What's the plan?" "Clean, hide, pretend everything's fine." Nancy let out a sharp laugh, devoid of humor. "The plan is survival. Lisa walks in here and sees the mess Charlotte just stirred up. We're done. All of us." David ran a hand through his hair, his nerves stretched thin. "We just have to make it look like we're in control. Like everything's normal." "Normal?" Nancy snapped, her voice trembling. "David, nothing about this is normal. Your mom is my therapist. I'm her client, and now she's about to walk into this." She gestured at the room, her frustration spilling over. "How do we make that normal?" David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud thud echoed from the hallway. All three of them froze. The sound was followed by another, a faint scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered, standing up. David grabbed the nearest object, a small, unfinished sculpture, and held it like a weapon. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. Nancy moved to follow him, but Marcus held her back. "Let him check it out first." David edged toward the hallway, every step cautious. His heart pounded in his ears as he flipped on the light. The bulb flickered briefly before steadying, casting a pale glow over the corridor. At first, everything seemed normal, until his eyes landed on one of his sculptures lying on the floor, toppled from its pedestal. He knelt to inspect it, his pulse racing. The base was intact, but the sculpture itself had a long crack running down its side. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. "What is it?" Nancy called from the other room. "One of my pieces fell," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's fine. I'll—" His words were cut off by the sound of glass shattering in the living room. He bolted back, finding Nancy and Marcus staring at a broken vase on the floor. Nancy's hands trembled as she picked up a shard. "I didn't touch it," she said, her voice barely audible. "It just fell." Marcus looked around, his eyes narrowing. "Okay, this is officially creepy." David crouched beside Nancy, taking the shard from her hand. "It's just the wind or something. Let's not—" Another noise interrupted him, this time a loud clang from the kitchen. They all turned in unison, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Nancy was the first to move, stepping into the kitchen with a determined look despite the fear etched on her face. Her gaze swept the room, landing on a cabinet door swinging open and closed, as if caught in a breeze, but the air was still. Too still. David joined her, gently closing the cabinet. "Maybe it's just—" "Just what?" Nancy snapped, her composure cracking. "Coincidence? David, everything is falling apart. Literally. Your mom's going to walk in here and—" Her phone buzzed, cutting her off. She snatched it from the counter, her hands trembling. A text message flashed on the screen. The sender was unknown. Desist before it's too late. Nancy's breath caught, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She handed it to David without a word. He stared at the message, his mind racing. "Who the hell would send this?" Marcus asked, leaning over to read the screen. "I don't know," Nancy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not the first one." David shot her a sharp look. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then gestured toward the counter. "Earlier tonight, I didn't say anything because I thought, I don't know, but this isn't random." Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, his unease now fully visible. "Okay, so we've got falling sculptures, breaking vases, and creepy texts. What's next? Poltergeists?" David glared at him. "Not helping." A sudden movement caught their attention, a figure standing just outside the window. Nancy gasped, and David instinctively stepped in front of her, holding the small sculpture like a shield. The figure didn't move. It was too dark to make out any details. But it was there, watching. "Who is that?" Nancy whispered, her voice shaking. David didn't answer. He inched closer to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure remained still, as though daring him to come closer. He reached out, slowly pulling back the curtain. The space outside was empty. Nancy let out a shaky breath. "Am I losing my mind?" "No," Marcus said firmly. "Someone's messing with us." David lowered the sculpture, his eyes scanning the yard. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. "We need to stay focused," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Lisa's almost here." Nancy nodded, but her face was pale, her usual strength worn thin. She picked up a broom and began sweeping the shards of the vase into a dustpan. Marcus moved to close the remaining windows, though he kept glancing over his shoulder as he worked. David returned to the counter, placing the dented bronze sculpture back in its rightful place. He ran a hand over its surface, the cool metal grounding him, if only for a moment. Behind him, Nancy's phone buzzed again. Another message. "Stop pretending. You know this will end badly." Nancy read it aloud, her voice trembling. Marcus cursed under his breath. "This is getting out of hand. We need to call someone." David shook his head. "And say what? That we're scared because of some text messages and a broken vase? They'll think we're crazy." "Well, we can't just sit here waiting for something worse to happen," Marcus argued. David looked at Nancy, who seemed on the verge of breaking. "We'll deal with it after Lisa leaves," he said quietly. "Right now, we just need to make it through tonight." As if on cue, the sound of footsteps approached the front door, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the quiet of the house. All three of them turned toward the sound, their hearts racing. Nancy's phone slipped from her hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. David grabbed the bronze sculpture again, holding it tightly as they waited for the inevitable knock. But it never came. Instead, the doorknob turned. The doorknob twisted, and the door creaked open slowly. David gripped the bronze sculpture tighter. Every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Nancy took a step back, her breath shallow. Marcus moved closer to the kitchen, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. Then, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Carlos, Nancy's ex-husband. "Carlos!" Nancy's voice cracked as she stared at him, disbelief and anger flashing across her face. "What are you doing here?" Carlos stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. He was impeccably dressed, his suit unwrinkled despite the tension in the air, and a smug smile played at his lips. "Is that any way to greet me, Nancy, after all we've been through?" David didn't lower the sculpture. "You need to leave," he said firmly. Carlos ignored him, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He lingered on the broken vase, the scattered tools, and finally on Nancy's pale face. "Quite the mess you've got here," he remarked, his voice calm but laced with something darker. "This is what you left me for. Chaos and—" He glanced at David, his smile widening. "Children." "Get out," Nancy snapped, finding her voice. She stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "You have no right to be here." Carlos held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Nancy. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to help." His gaze shifted back to David. "Although, from the looks of it, trouble has already found you." David's grip on the sculpture tightened. "You heard her. Leave." Carlos chuckled, finally turning his attention to David. "So, you're the one she's been talking about. The artist." He gestured around the room. "I have to say, I'm not impressed." "Carlos," Nancy said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Why are you here?" He shrugged, feigning innocence. "I wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay. You've been distant lately." Nancy's eyes narrowed. "You mean I've been avoiding you?" "For a reason." Carlos's expression hardened, the charm slipping for a moment. "We had something good, Nancy. Something real. And now you're throwing it away for this." He gestured at David with disdain. "A kid who probably doesn't even know what he wants out of life." David stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "I know exactly what I want, and it's not up to you." Carlos smirked, as if David's defiance amused him. "Is that so?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're in way over your head." Marcus finally spoke up, his tone sharp. "Why don't you save us all the speech and leave before this gets worse?" Carlos turned to Marcus, his smile returning. "And who's this? The backup? You must be the moral support. How's that working out for you?" "Carlos," Nancy interrupted, her voice cutting through the tension. "You don't belong here." "Leave." Carlos ignored her. Instead, he walked toward the bronze sculpture still clutched in David's hands. He studied it for a moment before reaching out as if to touch it. "Interesting piece. What's it supposed to be?" David yanked it back before Carlos could make contact. "Don't!" Carlos laughed softly, shaking his head. "Sensitive, aren't we?" He stepped back, his hands sliding into his pockets. "You've got a lot to learn, kid. Relationships aren't about passion or potential. They're about stability, security, things you can't offer her." "Enough!" Nancy's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "I said leave, Carlos, now." Carlos tilted his head, his expression softening slightly, though the condescension never left his eyes. "I'm not the enemy here, Nancy. I'm just trying to protect you from making a mistake." Nancy's voice dropped, cold and firm. "The only mistake I ever made was trusting you." The words seemed to land like a blow, but Carlos recovered quickly. He straightened his suit, his eyes hardening. "Fine, if that's how you feel." He started toward the door, but paused, glancing over his shoulder. "But remember, Nancy, when this all falls apart, and it will, I'll still be here." Nancy didn't respond, her glare enough to silence any further attempts at manipulation. Carlos opened the door, but didn't step through. Instead, he turned back, his smugness returning. Oh, one more thing. I brought a friend." Before anyone could react, Charlotte stepped into view, her calm and calculated demeanor as unsettling as ever. She smiled faintly, her gaze shifting between David and Nancy. "You two really do make quite the pair," Charlotte said, her tone dripping with faux warmth. "Carlos told me so much about you." "You're working together?" David asked, his voice laced with disbelief and anger. Carlos grinned, stepping aside to let Charlotte fully enter the room. "Let's just say we share similar concerns." Nancy's hands trembled as she pointed toward the door. "Get out! Both of you!" Charlotte raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Now, no need for hostility. We're just here to help." David's frustration boiled over. "Help? You've done nothing but make things worse. Both of you." Charlotte's smile didn't falter. "Sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better." "Enough of this," Marcus said, stepping forward. "You're both trespassing. Leave before we call the police." Carlos laughed, genuinely amused. "The police? Really? I think we can all handle this like adults." Nancy took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You need to leave. Now. Lisa is on her way, and I will not let her walk into this chaos." Charlotte's expression shifted slightly, her composure cracking just enough to reveal a hint of unease. She glanced at Carlos, who frowned. "Lisa's coming?" Charlotte asked, her voice quieter. "Yes," Nancy said, standing her ground. "And if you're still here when she arrives, I'll make sure she knows exactly what you've done." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Carlos sighed, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Fine. We're going." Charlotte hesitated, but eventually followed Carlos toward the door. Before stepping out, she turned back, her eyes locking onto David's. "I hope you're ready for what's coming." With that, the door closed behind them, leaving the house eerily quiet. David let out a shaky breath, lowering the sculpture he'd been gripping so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Nancy leaned against the counter, her head in her hands. "I can't believe this is happening." Marcus moved to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're gone. That's what matters." David didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the door, his mind racing. Charlotte's parting words felt less like a threat, and more like a promise. The silence was broken by the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Nancy's head shot up, her eyes wide with dread. "It's her," she whispered. David's stomach dropped. Lisa had arrived. The sound of the car door slamming outside sent a ripple of tension through the house. David felt his stomach twist as he exchanged a glance with Nancy. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Marcus stood by the window, peeking through the curtain. "It's her," Marcus confirmed, his voice low. "Lisa's here." Nancy straightened, brushing her hands down her sides as if trying to smooth away her nerves. "We can handle this," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "We have to." David wasn't so sure. The chaos of the night had left them all rattled, and with Lisa walking into the aftermath, it felt like the walls were closing in. The knock at the door was firm but not impatient. David hesitated for a moment before stepping forward to open it, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally pulled the door wide, Lisa stood there, her presence as composed and commanding as he remembered. She wore a fitted coat, her sharp eyes scanning the room before landing on David. "David," she said evenly. Her gaze moved past him to Nancy, then to Marcus. "It seems I've arrived at an interesting time." "Lisa," Nancy said, stepping forward, her voice calm but strained. "Thank you for coming." Lisa stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The weight of her presence filled the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. Her eyes swept over the scattered sculptures, the slightly disheveled state of the room, and finally landed on Nancy. "I'm assuming there's an explanation for all of this," Lisa said, her tone measured but firm. Nancy opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, Marcus interjected. "We've had a rough evening," he said, trying to keep things light. "Some uninvited guests. Nothing we couldn't handle." Lisa raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Instead, she turned her attention back to Nancy. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Nancy said quickly, though her voice faltered slightly. "Just tired." Lisa's eyes narrowed, and David could see her analyzing every detail, every hesitation. "And you, David?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," David said, though his grip on the back of the chair in front of him betrayed his tension. Lisa didn't look convinced. She stepped further into the room, her eyes landing on the bronze sculpture on the counter. She studied it for a moment before speaking. "This is yours, isn't it?" David nodded. "Yeah." Lisa turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "It's good. Raw, but it has potential." David blinked, caught off guard. Compliments from Lisa were rare, and usually carried hidden meanings. "Thanks," he said cautiously. Nancy stepped closer, her voice soft. "Lisa, I know this looks messy, but—" "Messy is an understatement," Lisa interrupted. Her tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm enough to make Nancy stop mid-sentence. "And I want to understand why." David felt a surge of frustration. "Because people keep showing up uninvited," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. "Carlos, Charlotte, they're the ones making this worse." Lisa's expression didn't change, but David could see a flicker of something in her eyes. Concern, maybe, or doubt. "Charlotte was here?" she asked. Nancy nodded. "She said you sent her. But it didn't feel right, Lisa. She wasn't here to help." Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. "I didn't send her." The room went silent. David exchanged a tense glance with Nancy, his mind racing. "Then why was she here?" he asked. Lisa shook her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Charlotte is ambitious. I can imagine her taking liberties. But I didn't expect this." Her gaze hardened as she looked at Nancy. "Did she say anything to you? Anything that stood out?" Nancy hesitated, her eyes flicking to David. "She said you were worried about boundaries. About me making bad choices." Lisa sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" David asked, his frustration boiling over. "Because, from where I'm standing, it feels like everyone's trying to tear us apart." Lisa looked at him, her expression softening slightly. "This isn't about tearing you apart, David. It's about ensuring that you're both making choices for the right reasons." "And you don't think we are?" Nancy challenged, her voice trembling slightly. Lisa hesitated, and for the first time, she looked unsure. "I think you're both under a lot of pressure. From yourselves, from others. That's not a foundation for anything lasting." David took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "We're trying, Lisa." "Isn't that enough?" Lisa looked at him, and for a moment, her carefully composed mask slipped. "I know you are, but sometimes trying isn't enough." The words hung in the air, heavy, and unspoken. Nancy's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the background. Before anyone could respond, the sound of footsteps outside made them all freeze. This time, they weren't deliberate or slow. They were frantic, hurried, as if whoever was approaching was in a rush. Lisa turned toward the door, her brow furrowing. "Are you expecting someone else?" Nancy shook her head. "No." The door burst open, and Carlos stumbled inside, his face pale and his expression wild. Behind him, Charlotte followed, her composure completely gone. "They're coming," Carlos said, his voice shaking. "Who's coming?" Lisa demanded, stepping forward. Charlotte's eyes locked onto Lisa's, and for the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't over." Lisa turned to David and Nancy, her expression grave. "We need to know everything. Right now." Lisa's eyes darted between Carlos and Charlotte, her sharp gaze slicing through the tension in the room. "Start talking," she commanded, her voice like a whip. Carlos leaned against the doorframe, clutching his side as if he'd run a marathon. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a pale, shaky demeanor. I didn't mean for it to go this far," he stammered. Nancy stepped forward, her voice cold and sharp. "What did you do, Carlos?" He looked at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "I just wanted to make you see reason, Nancy. I thought if I shook things up, you'd—" "Spit it out," David snapped, his patience wearing thin. Charlotte, who had been hovering in the background, crossed her arms and spoke, her tone clipped. "Carlos hired me, paid me to intervene and disrupt whatever this is." She gestured at David and Nancy. "He thought if I made things messy enough, you'd reconsider." Nancy's jaw dropped, fury flaring in her eyes. "You manipulated us. You brought her into my home to mess with my life." Carlos winced, his hands raised defensively. "It wasn't supposed to get out of hand. I just thought—" "You thought you could control me." Nancy's voice cut through his excuses like a knife. "You thought you could just waltz in and decide what's best for me, like always." David stepped closer to Carlos, his fists clenched. "You had no right." "I know," Carlos said weakly. "I know I screwed up, but—" He gestured to Charlotte, his voice trembling. She took it too far. This wasn't all me." Charlotte rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't try to pin this on me. You asked for chaos, and I delivered. But let's be clear, none of this would have worked if there weren't cracks already." "That's enough," Lisa snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos, her gaze locked on Charlotte, her expression ice-cold. "Leave. Now." Charlotte opened her mouth to argue but quickly thought better of it. She straightened her blazer, her composure snapping back into place like a mask. "Fine. But don't think this is over," she said, her tone eerily calm. With one last glance at David, she turned and strode out the door. Carlos lingered, his eyes pleading. "Nancy, go," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "Before I call the police." Carlos hesitated, but the look in Nancy's eyes left no room for negotiation. He nodded once, a shadow of the man he'd tried to project, and followed Charlotte out the door. The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Well, that was something." Nancy turned to Lisa, her shoulders sagging as the adrenaline drained from her body. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for all of this." Lisa shook her head, her expression softening. You don't need to apologize, Nancy. None of this is your fault. David leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. But it is mine, isn't it? I dragged all of this into your life. He looked at Nancy, his voice cracking. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm the problem. Nancy crossed the room and placed a hand on his arm. Don't you dare say that, David. You're not the problem. They are. But if we weren't, he started, but she cut him off. Stop. Don't let them get into your head. This is our life, not theirs. Lisa watched the exchange, her lips pressed into a thin line. She's right, she said after a moment. This isn't about blame. It's about figuring out where to go from here. Nancy let out a shaky breath and nodded. So, what do we do? Lisa's gaze softened as she looked at David. We start with the truth. About why this is happening. About what you both really want. Her eyes flicked to the bronze sculpture on the counter. And about what you're willing to fight for. David hesitated, his eyes locked on the sculpture. For so long, it had been a symbol of his potential, his passion, his purpose. But now it felt heavier, like it carried the weight of everything he'd failed to protect. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Nancy took his hand, her grip firm. You are, she said fiercely. I know you are. Lisa's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the moment. She pulled it out, her brow furrowing as she read the screen. It's a message from Charlotte, she said, her voice tense. What does it say? Marcus asked, leaning forward. Lisa's jaw tightened as she read the words aloud. This isn't over. You can't fix what's already broken. Nancy shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. What does she mean by that? Lisa didn't answer right away. She glanced at David, her expression unreadable. It means she's not done, and neither are we. A knock at the door made everyone freeze. David's grip tightened on Nancy's hand as Lisa moved to answer it. She paused, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and turned back to the group. Whatever happens next, she said, her voice firm, we face it together. She opened the door, and the storm outside seemed to roar in response. The knock on the door echoed through the house like a drumbeat. Everyone froze, the tension crackling in the air. David exchanged a wary glance with Nancy, whose hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles were pale. Lisa's calm demeanor betrayed none of the unease that hung over the room as she stepped forward, opening the door with a steady hand. Standing on the porch was a man none of them recognized. He was tall, dressed in a rain-soaked trench coat, and his face was shadowed by the dim light of the porch lamp. In his hand, he held a small envelope, sealed with an unfamiliar crest. Ms. Nancy Reeves, the man asked, his voice low and formal. His gaze swept over the group inside before landing on Nancy. Yes, Nancy said, her voice uncertain. The man handed her the envelope, then tipped his hat and walked away, disappearing into the rain. The door clicked shut behind him, and the sound of the storm outside became muffled once more. What is it? David asked, stepping closer to Nancy. I don't know, she said, staring at the envelope in her hands. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should, as though it carried something more than words. Lisa stepped closer, her expression guarded. Open it. Nancy hesitated but finally tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the edges crisp and clean. As she read, her face paled, her lips parting in shock. What does it say? David pressed, his voice rising. Nancy didn't answer right away. She handed the letter to Lisa, her hands trembling. "It's from Charlotte." Lisa's sharp eyes scanned the paper, her brow furrowing as she read aloud. "Nancy, you've always been strong, but strength won't save you this time. Walk away while you still can. David is not who you think he is." "See." "What the hell does that mean?" David demanded, his voice breaking. "It's just more manipulation," Marcus said from the corner, his tone steady but strained. "She's trying to scare you. That's her game." Lisa folded the letter and placed it on the table. "Charlotte is trying to control the narrative," she said calmly. "She's preying on doubt." Nancy shook her head, her arms wrapping around herself. "But why? Why go to these lengths?" "Because she's losing," Lisa replied simply. "And people like Charlotte don't lose quietly." David's chest tightened. "But why bring me into it? Why attack me?" Lisa turned to him, her expression softening. "Because you're part of this, David. Your connection to Nancy, to me, makes you a target." David felt the weight of her words settle on him like a stone. He turned to Nancy, his voice low. "Do you believe her? Do you think she's right about me?" Nancy's eyes met his, a storm of emotions swirling in their depths. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "Everything feels so twisted." David stepped back as if the words had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to respond but was interrupted by Marcus, who was holding a piece of paper he'd found on the floor near the door. Guys," Marcus said, holding it up. "This fell out of the envelope." Lisa snatched it from him, her eyes narrowing as she unfolded it. It was a photograph. On it was a blurry image of David, sitting in his studio, holding the unfinished bronze sculpture. The angle was odd, like it had been taken through a window. "Where did she get this?" Lisa demanded, her voice low and angry. David felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know. I didn't even know this picture existed." Nancy stared at the photograph, her face pale. "She's been watching you." "Watching us," Lisa corrected, her tone steely. "This isn't just about David or you, Nancy. This is about control. Charlotte is trying to tear this apart from every angle." Marcus stepped forward, his usual humor gone. "So what do we do now? Call the cops? Confront her?" Lisa shook her head. "No. She's smart. Everything she's done has been just on the edge of legality. Enough to unsettle, but not enough to incriminate." Nancy's hands clenched into fists. "So we just sit here and wait for her to strike again?" "No," Lisa said, her voice calm but firm. "We push back, but we do it on our terms." David, still staring at the photograph, shook his head. "She's not going to stop. Even if we push back, she'll find another way." Lisa stepped closer to him, her voice low. "Then we make her stop. Together." Nancy turned to Lisa, desperation in her voice. "How? How do we make her stop?" Lisa's expression hardened. "By taking away her leverage. She's banking on our fear, on the cracks she's trying to exploit. But if we stand firm, if we don't let her shake us, she loses." David nodded slowly, but the unease in his chest remained. "And what if she has more? More pictures, more threats?" Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm. "Then we face it, one step at a time." The room fell silent, the weight of Lisa's words settling over them like a blanket. For a moment, no one moved, the only sound the steady rhythm of the rain against the windows. Then Nancy spoke, her voice trembling but resolute. "We need to figure out where she's watching us from. How she's doing this." Marcus nodded, his usual levity replaced by quiet determination. I'll check the outside, see if there are cameras or anything. Lisa turned to Nancy. We'll go through the house. Look for anything out of place. What about me? David asked, his voice quiet but steady. Lisa met his gaze, her expression softening. You focus on what you do best. Your art. Your truth. That's what Charlotte is trying to undermine. David hesitated but finally nodded. He turned toward the bronze sculpture on the counter, his fingers brushing over its cool surface. It felt like a lifeline, a tether to something real in the chaos surrounding him. As they moved to carry out their tasks, a faint sound echoed through the house. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A soft, deliberate knock. This time at the back door. The soft knock at the back door sent a ripple of tension through the house. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, the faint patter against the windows only amplifying the silence inside. David's pulse raced as he glanced at Nancy, who stood rooted to the spot, her face pale and drawn. "I'll check," Marcus whispered, already moving toward the kitchen. He grabbed a flashlight from the counter and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the dim light. "Be careful," Nancy murmured, her voice barely audible. Marcus nodded, his movements deliberate as he reached the door. He peered through the small window, his breath fogging the glass. A moment later, he turned back to the group, his brow furrowed. "There's nobody there." David frowned, stepping closer. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Marcus unlocked the door and pulled it open. The flashlight beam swept over the empty backyard, revealing nothing but wet grass and the faint outline of trees beyond the fence. "See? No one." Lisa, who had remained quiet until now, moved to stand beside Marcus. "She's toying with us," she said, her tone calm but sharp, "trying to keep us off balance." Nancy exhaled shakily, leaning against the counter. "How much longer can this go on? It feels like she's everywhere." "She won't win," Lisa said firmly, turning back to the group. "People like Charlotte thrive on chaos, but they don't expect resistance. We hold steady, and she'll crack." David wasn't so sure. Every step forward seemed to reveal another twist, another trap set to make them stumble. He crossed his arms, his gaze drifting to the bronze sculpture on the counter. The imperfections in its surface mirrored the fractures in his own resolve. Lisa seemed to sense his hesitation. She approached him, her voice softer now. "David, I know this feels insurmountable, but this isn't just about Charlotte or her games. It's about you, about what you stand for." David looked at her, his jaw tightening. "What I stand for feels small right now. Weak." Lisa shook her head. "It's not. Your work, your heart, that's your strength. Don't let her take that from you." Nancy stepped closer, her hand brushing against David's arm. "We're in this together," she said quietly. "No matter what." Before he could respond, Marcus's voice cut through the moment. "Guys, I found something." They turned to see him crouching near the base of the back door, his flashlight trained on something small and metallic. Lisa stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Marcus held it up, a tiny device, barely larger than a coin. "It's a camera!" Nancy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "She's been watching us," she whispered. Lisa's expression darkened. "That explains the photograph, and the timing of everything tonight." She took the device from Marcus, studying it closely. "This isn't amateur work. Charlotte's either very resourceful or has someone helping her." David felt a surge of anger. "So, What do we do? Smash it. Leave it here and pretend we don't know. Lisa shook her head. No, we keep it. It's evidence. Nancy looked at Lisa, her eyes wide. You think we can use it against her? Possibly, Lisa said, but more importantly, it tells us something critical. Charlotte's been desperate enough to escalate. That means she's running out of options. Marcus stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. So now we turn the tables. Lisa nodded. Exactly. We take away her control, and that starts with making it clear we're not afraid. Nancy let out a shaky breath, nodding along. How? Lisa placed the camera on the counter, her gaze sweeping over the group. We stop reacting. We focus on what matters: truth, clarity, and each other. Everything else, we let it fall away. David's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He wasn't sure he believed Lisa's confidence, but he had nothing else to hold on to. He glanced at Nancy, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. As they began cleaning up the remnants of the evening, the mood in the house shifted. The tension remained, but there was an undercurrent of determination now, a resolve to face whatever came next. David returned to the sculpture, his hands moving almost instinctively as he smoothed the surface with a cloth. The imperfections remained, but there was something comforting in its flawed beauty. It was a reminder that strength didn't come from perfection, but from persistence. Lisa watched him for a moment before stepping into the kitchen with Nancy. Marcus lingered near the door, keeping an eye on the quiet backyard. You okay? Nancy asked softly, her hand brushing against David's. He nodded, though his chest still felt heavy. I don't know what's going to happen, he admitted, but I want to fight for this. For us. Nancy smiled, her eyes glistening. Then we fight. Before the moment could settle, Marcus's voice called out from the back door. Guys, we've got company. David turned, his heart sinking as he saw a shadowy figure approaching from the backyard. The tension returned, sharp and immediate. Lisa moved to the door, her body language calm but alert. The figure stepped into the dim light, and David's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Charlotte. It was Carlos. What now? Marcus muttered, stepping back as Carlos approached. Carlos raised his hands, his expression weary. I'm not here to fight, he said, his voice low. I came to apologize. Lisa stepped forward, her expression hard. You've done enough damage for one night. I know, Carlos said, his gaze dropping. I messed up. I was angry, and I let that cloud my judgment. But you have to believe me. Charlotte's not done. She's dangerous. Nancy folded her arms, her voice cold. Why should we believe anything you say? Carlos looked at her, his eyes earnest. Because I was wrong, and I see that now. But Charlotte, she doesn't care who she hurts. She'll destroy all of you if it means getting what she wants. David stepped forward, his jaw tight. Then why are you here? Carlos hesitated before answering. Because I don't want to see her win. And because I want to make things right. Lisa studied him for a long moment before stepping aside. Come in. But if you're lying. I'm not, Carlos said, stepping into the house. As the door closed behind him, the storm outside picked up again, the wind howling through the night. David's grip on the bronze sculpture tightened, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. Lisa's voice broke the silence. This isn't over. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.